Today we're going to continue with Chapter 9, World War II, 1939 to 1945, and we're going to look at Section 5, the Road to Victory. This will cover what the Allies do to eventually defeat Fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, and Imperialist Japan. Now, the United States is now in a war against Germany. Roosevelt and Churchill pick General Dwight D. Eisenhower to command all Allied forces in Europe. Churchill and Roosevelt realized they needed just one commander to command combined British, American, Free French, and all the other Allied forces except the Soviet Union. The Allies decide on an invasion of North Africa. The goal is to trap the Germans and Italians in Tunisia. So on November 8th, 1942, about 11 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Allies, US and British troops, land soldiers in northwest Africa. Now, the British had been driving the German Afrika Korps and Erwin Rommel west since the Battle of El Alamein, and they're heading to Tunisia. Now, while this is going on, the Americans and British invade Morocco and Algeria from the west, and the goal here is to trap them in Tunis and force them to surrender. One of America's top generals, George S. Patton, emerges in North Africa as being an aggressive leader. He would earn the nickname Old Blood and Guts and come out of the war as one of our more famous generals. Now, in May 1943, the trapped German and Italian forces in Africa surrender. 250,000 men, including a major part of Italy's army. Hitler had ordered that they fight to the death, but instead they surrendered. Here we see them on the tip of Tunisia, and they just surrendered to the British and Americans. July of 1943, the Allies next invade and capture the island of Sicily. British and Americans capture Sicily in only 38 days. The American forces were led by General George S. Patton, and the British forces were led by Field Marshal Montgomery. They were the top generals in Europe from the American and British, and they had incredible egos, and they did not get along. They always wanted to see more fame for themselves than each other and seemed to race to objectives to see if they can outdo the other side. Now here we see the Americans and British. They do land in Sicily and capture the island in just 38 days. Now for the Italians, Sicily is the last straw, and the Italians overthrow Mussolini. His 21-year rule is over, and he's made a prisoner. The Germans actually rescue him. Now a new Italian government joins the Allies, so Hitler sends troops to take over Italy. After Sicily, the Allies next looked to invade Italy. They thought it would be easy. It wasn't. In September of 1943, the Allies land in Italy. The British landed on the southern tip, and the Americans land a week later further north at Salerno. It's a city just south of Naples. Here we see a picture of American GIs and an American Sherman tank fighting through the streets of Salerno. The plan was to march north through Italy. However, the Germans did a great job defending Italy. It's a narrow peninsula. It's only 150 miles from sea to sea, and there's a lot of mountains, making it really easy for the Germans to defend it. So it is very slow going for the Allies, basically a war of attrition. The Germans built a defensive line across the peninsula. Now the Allies try to get around it by landing at Anzio, but this doesn't work. Here we see American LSTs unloading vehicles at Anzio. Now, the Allies take months to break through the lines, costing thousands of lives. In June of 1944, the Americans captured Rome. It took them 9 months. Here we see Americans on Sherman tanks driving past the famous Colosseum while Italian citizens cheered for them. The Allies would not take control of Italy until the end of the war. The Germans did that good a job. In fact, the German troops in Italy surrendered a couple weeks after Hitler had killed himself. Now we're going to discuss the air war over Germany. Early in the war, the Germans had bombed Warsaw and Rotterdam, and famously London and other British cities during the Blitz. During the Blitz, it was the Germans' goal to break the morale of the British people so they would not want to fight anymore. But now the tables are turning, and it's the British and the Americans who are going to start bombing Germany. Their goals are, 1, to destroy Germany's ability to produce weapons, and 2, to break the German people's will to fight back. Now the British plan, since they couldn't really hit factories, and they figured factories could be rebuilt anyway, was to kill the factory workers and destroy their homes. Large-scale bombing raids level German cities and kill thousands of civilians. On July 23, 1943, British and American bombers would bomb the German city of Hamburg, and they would bomb it for 7 nights. Hamburg is the second largest city in Germany, and you can see here in this photograph all the fires from all the fire bombs that were dropped on it. It's actually silhouetting a British bomber flying over it. All those incendiary bombs caused a firestorm, which is kind of like a fire tornado. It will kill 42,600 civilians and damage 80% of the city. Berlin is bombed 314 times during World War II. 90% of the city is destroyed. This was one of their train stations. The famous Hertie department store, and the Catholic Cathedral in Berlin. In February of 1945, at the end of World War II, British and American bombers hit the old Baroque city of Dresden. It starts a large firestorm that will kill 25,000 people. Here we can see some of the devastation caused by the bombing raid. This was a famous picture taken from the City Hall. The statue on the right appears to be saying, "Why did this have to happen?" In 1944, the British and Americans would invade France. They're going to start a second front against Germany. Germany will now have to defend against the Allies in the West and South, as well as the Soviets in the East. Now, the opening of the Second Front would start with the most famous invasion in history, the D-Day invasion at Normandy, June 6, 1944. It's been called the longest day. It's been called the Day of Days. The Americans and British would invade France. They knew it, and the Germans knew it. In fact, the Germans had built large fortifications along the French coast called the Atlantic Wall. The plan of the Germans was to defeat any invasion on the beach. They built obstacles along the beach to wreck Allied ships. Eisenhower's plan was to cross the English Channel and land on the beaches of Normandy in France. The Germans expected an invasion, but did not expect it at Normandy, since that was a little further away. They expected it to be an invasion area near Calais, which was closer to Germany. Here we see a picture of Eisenhower the night before talking to members of the 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, before they parachuted into France. The plan was to cross from England, across the English Channel, and land on the beaches at Normandy. So on June 6, 1944, Allied troops land in France. This is the largest invasion of history. The night before, American and British paratroopers land in Normandy. American, British, and Canadian troops land on beaches at Normandy. Here we see Americans coming in on landing craft, coming up on the beaches while the Germans were shooting at them. This was actually a LST that my uncle was an executive officer on during the Normandy invasion. They didn't come in with the first wave. They were mostly a second wave. They would bring in vehicles. They would go up on the beaches. The front doors would open up, and vehicles could come out. Here we see more of the LSTs. My uncle's ship is somewhere down there. The Americans landed on Utah and Omaha beaches, the British on Golden Sword, and the Canadians on Juno. These were actually code names for the beaches. Omaha Beach was the worst. It got the nickname Bloody Omaha. This was the beach scene you see in the movie Saving Private Ryan with Tom Hanks. It was the most heavily defended and caused heavy casualties, 3,881 Americans killed, wounded, or missing. Now, after the landing, the Allies fight across France. The 12th Army Group, which had led by General Omar Bradley, was the largest ever in the history of the world. 4 armies with over 1,300,000 men, including the new U.S. Third Army, led by General George Patton, and Montgomery would lead the British Army through France. So here we have the two egos who are now determined to get to Berlin first. Spoiler alert, neither one does. In August of 1944, Paris is liberated. These are soldiers of the Free French Division. They were supplied with American uniforms and helmets, but it's the French who are given the honor of liberating their own capital city. The Allies are moving fast across France into Germany, and the Germans can't stop them. But they are going to try. As the Allies push their way across France and get close to the border with Germany, Hitler wants to try one last desperate attempt to stop them, and this will lead to what becomes known as the Battle of the Bulge. December 16, 1944 to January 25, 1945. The Battle of the Bulge is the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States in World War II. Now, the Germans saved up enough men, gasoline, and tanks for one last major offensive. And it works at first. They start to push the Allies back. It was a winter offensive. Here you see German tanks pushing into the Allied lines, the American lines, actually. And the Americans were caught totally by surprise. Hundreds were captured. And the weather was bad, keeping Allied planes grounded. 200,000 German soldiers and over 340 tanks led the breakthrough. Here we see the German border, and the blue line was between the Germans and the Allies, and the offensive pushing in. They surround this Belgian city of Bastogne. That's where the 101st Airborne was. They keep going and forming this bulge in the line. It was actually coined by newspaper men. But it's going to stop. The Americans regrouped, and they will go on to defeat the Germans. Here we see a picture of the 101st Airborne, the famous band of brothers, surrounded in Bastogne. Despite numerous attacks by the Germans, they refuse to surrender. And they hold the German army up for a crucial 5 days and never give up. The Allies start closing in, Patton from the south, Montgomery from the north. The German tanks start running out of gas. Gasoline is, because of all the Allied bombings, is a major shortage in Germany. So the Germans are forced to retreat, or as you see in this picture, just surrender. The Germans now can't stop the Allies from pushing into Germany. But Eisenhower decides to allow the Soviets to capture Berlin. The Soviets want the honor because they've been fighting the Germans for much longer and suffered terribly by the Germans. And Eisenhower felt that the Germans will fight very hard defending Berlin. So he doesn't want to waste American and British lives as long as the Soviets are willing to do it. This, of course, does not make Field Marshal Montgomery or General Patton very happy, since they both wanted the glory of capturing Berlin. But Eisenhower was thinking about the lives of the American and British soldiers. Here we see the Americans and Soviets meeting on the Elbe River. The Soviets are on the right, the Americans on the left. Ironically, within a few years, both sides will be pitted in the Cold War. Now, on April 12th, President Franklin D. Roosevelt dies. Vice President Harry S. Truman becomes president. Now we're going to talk about the fall of Berlin. Since Germany's defeat at Stalingrad in January of 1943, the Soviets have been pushing the Germans back, and finally in 1945 they entered Germany. And by April 20th of 45, the Soviets reached Berlin and surround the city. It was Hitler's 56th birthday, which he celebrates in his bunker in Berlin, as the Soviets shoot rockets and artillery shells into the city. Now, the Germans defend Berlin with old men and young children. They don't have much of a military left. Most of it has been killed or captured by the Russians or the Americans and British. So most of the soldiers, here's an SS soldier who's 14 years old. Young boys as young as 11 and 12. Old men in their 50s and 60s, even teaching Grandpa to fire anti-tank rockets. And don't forget Mom. We got to make sure Mom can fight the Russians too. Now the Soviets push into Berlin, block by block, house by house. On April 30th, 10 days later, the Soviets capture the Reichstag building. This is the famous picture of a Soviet soldier on the top of the Reichstag holding up a communist flag. Now, about 10 blocks from the Reichstag is the Chancellery building, and beneath it is the Führer bunker. This is a large concrete bunker built 30 feet below ground with massive amounts of cement so it could withstand the Allied bombings. And Hitler has been down there for over a month, never really leaves it. On the 30th, he marries his girlfriend, Eva Braun. And then that night, they both commit suicide. Here we see some American soldiers examining the trench where supposedly Hitler's body had been cremated. It was, but before the Americans got there, the Russians had taken what was left of it away. But it doesn't matter. Hitler was dead. And on May 8th, Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Allies. And we see Eisenhower celebrate it. And this day will become known as VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. The King and Queen and Winston Churchill will celebrate on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. On the far left of the picture, you'll see the current Queen Elizabeth. And of course, Times Square is packed with people cheering. Of course, with Germany's defeat, the war is not over yet because there's still Japan. So now we're going to look at what the Americans do to achieve victory in the Pacific. Now, after winning at Guadalcanal in 1943, the United States knew it would be difficult defeating the Japanese on the many islands they controlled. Americans realized that the Japanese would defend every island to the last man. So Admiral Nimitz came up with a plan called island hopping. The plan says to only attack islands that were needed and to leave the others behind. The islands would be isolated and useless to the Japanese war effort, and eventually they'd be forced to surrender. The plan was a good plan because it would save time and American lives. So between 1943 and 1944, the U.S. fought for island after island, getting closer to Japan. But the Japanese fought and died. Very few surrendered. On the island of Tarawa, the Marines landed. Over 1,000 Marines died. Of the 5,000 Japanese defenders, only 17 were alive at the end. Here we see Guadalcanal at the bottom, and the Americans taking the island of Tarawa. From there, they would move to Kwajalein and it's Eniwetok. From there to Saipan. Now, in 1944, the U.S. Navy destroys much of the Japanese Navy in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The U.S. Fifth Fleet had 15 aircraft carriers along with 7 battleships, including the brand new USS New Jersey. The U.S. will shoot down 240 Japanese planes in what the Americans called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan loses 3 carriers, around 600 planes, and 445 of its best remaining pilots. The losses of Japan were irreplaceable. The U.S. actually has very little losses. It's a decisive American victory. U.S. bombers can now bomb Japan. The United States has a new high-altitude bomber, the B-29 Superfortress. It's the first bomber plane that is actually pressurized so they can fly higher without having the pilots have to get oxygen. Now, this will lead to the invasion of the Philippines. In October of 1944, the United States invades the Philippines. We can see here. MacArthur wanted an invasion of the Philippines to fulfill his famous vow, "I shall return." Here we see a picture of MacArthur coming ashore in the Philippines. This would be a large land, air, and sea battle, and will destroy what was left of the Japanese Navy. And we'll see the first use of kamikaze or suicide planes by the Japanese. They'll actually fly planes right into American ships. Now, Iwo Jima was the second to last major island the United States would fight for. On February 19, 1945, the same time Russian troops were heading toward Berlin, the U.S. Marines land on the beaches. Iwo Jima is about 670 miles from Tokyo. By now, Japan has no ships or planes to help in the defense of Iwo Jima. It's a volcanic island, and the ground is very hard, so there's very little foxhole, so the Marines are really caught in the open. On the right of this photograph, you can see Mount Suribachi, which was the high point of the island where the Japanese would fire down on the Marines. It would take 4 days for the Marines to slowly fight up to capture Mount Suribachi. But when they did, they raised the American flag, and this becomes the very famous iconic image of the Marines raising the flag on Iwo Jima. Terrible fighting on the island. It would take 25 days to capture it. Most Japanese soldiers fought to the death. In the end, only 216 gave up. The United States Marine Corps War Memorial outside Washington, D.C. memorializes all the U.S. Marines with a statue of the famous picture. If you ever travel to the Marine Museum in Virginia, the architecture kind of resembles the men raising the flag. Inside the museum, I took this picture, you can actually get the flag that was raised on Iwo Jima. And if you go to the gift shop, they even have a Lego statue. Thought this was kind of cute. The Battle of Okinawa. On April 1st, 1945, the United States will invade the island of Okinawa, starting the largest sea, land, and air battle in military history. Okinawa is a small island. It's about 80 miles by 18 miles, about the size of Guadalcanal, and it's south of Japan. The fighting was very difficult. The defenders fought from caves. It would take 82 days to capture the island, and many Americans would be killed. Kamikaze attacks would sink or damage 245 ships, including here where we see the USS Franklin. I remember when I was working back when I was in high school, I worked with a man who was actually stationed on the Franklin when it was sinking, and he had burn marks still on his arm from the attack. "18,900 U.S. soldiers were killed on Okinawa. That was 2 times as many soldiers at Iwo Jima, along with Guadalcanal. 76,000 Japanese soldiers and 27,000 Japanese civilians were killed. So as you can imagine, the United States military was very concerned about the cost of actually invading the Japanese islands themselves. Now, April 12th, as we mentioned earlier, this is when Roosevelt dies and Truman becomes president. Now, the Allies knew invading Japan would be difficult. The Japanese would fight and not give up. They showed how desperately they fought on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, preferring to die than to surrender. So the Americans knew that they would have very heavy casualties invading Japan. In fact, the U.S. military expected anywhere from 1.7 to 4 million American casualties. But this would never happen. The Americans would never happen to have to invade Japan because of the Manhattan Project. In 1942, the U.S. decided to develop an atomic bomb, also known as the A-bomb. It was led by the scientist Robert Oppenheimer. It was an extremely top-secret project. In fact, Truman doesn't even learn about it until after Roosevelt dies and he's sworn in as president. Now, they tested in New Mexico in July of 45. This is after the war in Europe is over. And Truman is told, and he actually believes, that the weapon can end the war without invading Japan, and orders the atomic bombs to be dropped on Japan. The United States will drop 2 bombs on 2 Japanese cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and destroy them both. Hiroshima would be bombed on August 6th at 8:15 in the morning. One B-29 bomber would drop that bomb. Here's an artist's rendition of the bomber and the bomb falling. It was the Enola Gay. This is a picture of their crew in front of their B-29 bomber. You can see the bomber today. I took this picture in the Smithsonian Air Museum, which is down in Virginia. They're very large planes, by the way, very large. I couldn't even get the whole plane in my focus of the picture. 80,000 died in a flash, maybe up to 200,000 later. The bomb destroyed 2/3 of the city of Hiroshima, 52 of the city's 55 hospitals, and it leveled almost every building. One of the buildings, which was kind of an industrial conference hall, famous for its glass dome, was heavily damaged with the bomb, though not just totally destroyed. The Japanese have left it exactly the way it was the day the bomb fell. Today it's known as the Hiroshima Peace Memorial. But despite all the devastation in Hiroshima, Japan does not surrender. So the Americans will drop a second bomb 2 days later on Nagasaki. A B-29, a different B-29, will drop this bomb. It was actually larger than the first, but less people died because of the way the mountains were, and it reflected some of the atomic blast. But 40,000 did die in a flash. This is a picture of a Catholic cathedral in Nagasaki. Now, the 2 atomic bombs did not kill as many as died in all the firestorms in Tokyo. However, it was only 2 planes. Japan finally decides to surrender. Now, August 15th, Japan surrenders. This is known as VJ Day, Victory in Japan. September 2nd, the surrender was signed in Tokyo Harbor on board the battleship USS Missouri. Here's the Japanese delegation coming on board. And here's the signing of the surrender. Admiral Nimitz is signing the documents there. General MacArthur is on the far left, and Admiral Halsey just to his right. This is actually a recreation of what the documents are. These are on the USS Missouri today. I visited here with my 2 nephews a number of years ago. The plaque you see there is exactly where the table was, where they signed the terms of surrender. Well, that concludes our road to victory. I know it was a long one. but I'm going to give you an extra day to do it. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something about it. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. All right, goodbye.